Our passage today draws us into the idea that if we don't get going, we won't get God. So let's explore that idea. Some years ago, me and my family went canyoning in the Lake District. For those of us who don't know what that is, let me explain. We went to the bottom of a narrow river valley, got dressed in wetsuits and helmets, and with a guide, we proceeded to work our way up the river, taking time to slide into pools and down short waterfalls and do things that looked braver and cleverer than perhaps they were. And then at the end, there was the jump. Our guide took us a short walk for a bit further up the mountain and then back to the edge of what was no longer a valley, but was actually now a crevasse, looking down into the boiling river some 15 to 20 metres below, with sheer rock walls on either side. And that crevasse was no more than about 4 metres wide from my memory. For some reason, I decided to trust our guide, who said it was okay to jump. Just aim down, fold your arms and jump, he said. I can tell you no sensible person would do this. There was a very real possibility of hitting the walls on either side on the way down. I had no personal experience of this river and no direct idea of how deep it was. I'd never jumped into a swimming pool from this height, and yet here I was jumping in spite of what I could see, in spite of what I could imagine could go wrong, and in spite of all good sense. The drop was so long, you actually had time to think about how long the drop was. And of course it was fine and rather jolly, and I wanted to enjoy the full experience, and I loved messing around in rivers. So whilst it was pretty scary and certainly not sensible, it was nevertheless a good thing to do. I tell you that story because it illustrates the really important message of our passage today. That message is, will you trust what you see, or will you trust who you hear? Will you trust what you see, or will you trust who you hear? Now, unfortunately for us, our lectionary reading lets us down, because if you want to understand this passage, you actually need to read chapters 7 to 10. And I have to give you a flavour of those things to help you understand the gospel reading. The problem we've got, of course, is that if you just read those verses on their own, it's a bit like turning the TV on in the middle of a political debate, listening to 20 seconds, turning it off again, and hoping you've understood what they were going on about. And that's no way to understand political debate, and it's no way to understand the Bible, frankly. So I'm going to have to furnish some of the gaps for us. In chapters 7 and 8, Jesus is doing his usual thing of winding up the sceptical Jews and Pharisees. That's what he does with aplomb. They're challenging him about the validity of the teaching he brings, and he challenges them and their sensibilities right back. He, for example, heals on the Sabbath. He then declares that they are children of the devil. And so really wind them up. He says, before Abraham was, I am, which is Jewish shorthand for I'm eternal and I'm God. If you wanted to alienate your Jewish hearers, these statements were the shortcut. But the important theme that's being drawn out is that according to their eyes, what they saw, according to their tradition, how they saw things, and according to their history, which is why they saw as they did, Jesus really was a bad apple. Now, if we carry on with our canyoning idea, they were the people standing on the side of the crevasse with the opposite wall far too close, the drop to the bottom far too far, and the depth of the water far too deep and fast. What Jesus said was just too much for them, because what they saw and what Jesus said was just too crazy, too offensive, and just downright heretical according to their worldview. So the question that's asked and answered in this section is whether we can blame the Jews for rejecting Jesus' teaching if that was the only way they could see. Now, the short answer to that question, unfortunately, is yes, we can blame them. But let's ask why. Why is that? Well, the answer to that is tucked away in chapter 7 at the beginning of the debate, where Jesus says this: if anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking of my own authority. to briefly interpret that, he's saying that if our intention towards God is facing the right way, our perception of God will follow. Let me repeat that for us to absorb that. If our intention is facing the right way, our perceptions will follow. You'll have heard me preach before about the Jesus who says to the disciples, "Follow me," and they have no idea who he is really at that point, but they learn who he is in the following. That's really the idea. In summary, if you're facing the right way, you'll see the right way. So when he says in the debate that the Pharisees are children of the devil, he's making the point that they're facing the wrong way, and because of that, their perceptions of Jesus are all messed up. So it's intention and direction that change our perception. Intention, direction, change perception. Now, the next big point is made in the healing of the blind beggar in chapter 9. The teaching is built into how Jesus heals him, incidentally, not just that he does. So let me describe that healing. In the story, it says this: Jesus spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So the beggar went and washed and came back seeing. I'd like to ask Dr. Rawlinson here whether squishing mud onto somebody's blind eyes is going to be much good for them. He thinks not. Quite right too. To smear mud on a blind person's eyes is not going to help. It's going to make things actually worse. You've, I'm sure, been to the beach with children, and when the inevitable sand gets in their eyes, you realise the whole day is ruined. Now, I can guarantee that pasting mud on a blind man's eyes is not the way to go about the job. But a part of what's being taught here, and this is what I want you to hear, is the sheer perversity of the way of Jesus. He doesn't make sense according to the normal way of seeing things, which is, again, the key point. But the important teaching is that the blind man is told to go and wash in the pool that is named Sent, the pool of Siloam. So the restoration of the man's sight happens when he goes where he is sent. Then in going, he returns and sees Jesus. And in seeing Jesus, he becomes a worshipper. So let's develop our idea a little further. It's intention and direction with the addition of action that changes perception. It's intention, direction, and action that changes perception. And his experience gets us back to our first point, that if we don't get going, we don't get God. This is, of course, the challenge of discipleship for us all. It's all very well being good at religion, like the Pharisees were, but in the end, we're invited not simply to believe, but to follow if we are to see well. So like me on the crevasse side, being told by the guide that all would be well, we're being taught that we must trust our ears, not our eyes. Because we won't jump if we listen to what we see. We just won't. But if we just might, if we close our eyes and listen and trust and jump. So now, having done that foundation, we can rejoin our reading about sheep, the shepherd, the sheep pen, and thieves and robbers, which Jen talked about, which, taken together with the whole debate, tells us this. If we want to see and understand Jesus, we must want to do the will of God. And in wanting, we must listen for the voice of God, and in hearing, we must act on the call of God. Then in acting, we'll be given the blessing and grace of seeing and understanding God. I can tell you that if I'd been on the side of that crevasse alone, I would not have jumped. But I wanted to experience the river, and I trusted the voice of my guide. So I jumped into the waters, and all the experience and the pleasure is now mine. So let's finish this sermon with where we started. The statement, if we don't get going, we won't get God. But at a deeper level, we're actually being asked a much harder question. Is it our will to do God's will? Amen.